The Sleepwalker. Chapter 1. The Nightmare Begins. A chill crept down Thomas Reed's spine as consciousness dragged him from the depths of slumber. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the darkness that enveloped the bedroom he shared with his wife, Emily. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Sitting up, he noticed a sticky wetness coating his hands. He stumbled to the light switch and flicked it on. A gasp escaped his lips. Blood. It was everywhere. Smeared across his palms, caked under his fingernails, soaking into his pajama sleeves. His heart raced as confusion gave way to icy terror. "Emily!" His voice came out as a hoarse whisper. No response. Thomas lurched to the bathroom, frantically scrubbing at his skin, the water swirling crimson down the drain. His mind reeled. This had to be a nightmare, some perverse trick of his subconscious. But the metallic scent of blood was too real, the bone-deep chill too vivid. Dashing downstairs, he called out for Emily again, louder this time. Silence hung heavy in the air. He searched every room, the living room with the half-finished jigsaw puzzle, the kitchen with dirty dishes still in the sink. No sign of her. Just an unnerving stillness that seemed to mock his rising panic. He reached for the phone to dial 911, but froze. What would he even say? That he woke up covered in blood with no memory of what happened? They'd think he was insane, or worse, guilty of something unspeakable. Guilt. It crashed over him like a tidal wave, stealing his breath. Where was Emily? Had his damn sleepwalking done something to her this time? No, that was impossible. After years of living with his condition, Emily knew how to handle it. She'd always been there in the morning, reassuring him after an episode. He couldn't have hurt her, could he? Thomas slumped onto the couch, head in his blood-stained hands, racking his brain for any scrap of memory. All that surfaced were hazy flashes, a glint of metal, muffled screams, a familiar face contorted in fear. Each image made his stomach churn with dread. As the clock ticked on and Emily failed to appear, the awful reality sank in like clammy tendrils around his heart. His wife was missing, and he was the only one here, drenched in blood he couldn't explain. Whatever had transpired in the lost hours of the night, one thing was clear. Their lives had just splintered into a waking nightmare. Nausea rising in his throat, Thomas reached again for the phone, his crimson-streaked fingers trembling. He had to call for help. But in the pit of his stomach, a sickening certainty took root. No matter what unfolded next, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2. The Investigation. A siren's wail pierced the pre-dawn gloom as red and blue lights painted macabre patterns on the Reeds' white-clapboard house. Thomas sat hunched on his porch steps, hands still stained rusty red, watching through hollow eyes as uniformed officers swarmed his property like ants. "Mr. Reed," a gruff voice barked, "I'm Detective Nowak. We need to ask you some questions down at the station." Thomas looked up into a stony face weathered by years of dealing with the dregs of humanity. Nowak's gaze bored into him, hard and accusatory, as if he'd already rendered his verdict. Licking dry lips, Thomas struggled to find his voice. I don't know what happened. Please, you have to find Emily." Nowak's eyes narrowed. "You saying you didn't have nothing to do with your wife going missing? 'Cause way I see it, a woman don't just up and vanish in the middle of the night without someone else being involved." A mix of anger and desperation flared in Thomas's chest. "You think I hurt her? For God's sake, I love Emily. I could never—" His words sounded weak even to his own ears. In the stark light of day, covered in damning crimson stains, his protest felt flimsy, laughable. The detective just shook his head, lips curling in disgust. "You can tell it to the captain. Let's go." He hauled Thomas up by the elbow, grip biting. At the station, the cloying scent of stale coffee mingled with industrial cleaner as Thomas slumped in a metal chair, a one-way mirror looming judgmentally beside him. The room seemed to close in, echoing the trapped sensation ballooning in his chest. "Walk me through last night," Nowak demanded, pen poised over a battered notepad. "Don't leave anything out." Thomas swallowed hard. Where to even start? The beginning was veiled in a murky haze, like a half-remembered dream slipping through grasping fingers. I went to bed around 11, he began haltingly. Emily was already asleep. The next thing I remember is waking up covered in blood. Emily was gone. He trailed off, the words covered in blood reverberating obscenely in the stark room. Nowak leaned forward, lips pursed. "So you're claiming what? Amnesia? How convenient. Funny how often that turns up with guilty husbands." "I'm not claiming anything," Thomas burst out. "I'm telling you the truth. I sleepwalk sometimes. I don't always remember." The detective scoffed. "Sleepwalking? That's a new one. You really want to go with that?" Thomas gritted his teeth, frustration and fear warring in his gut. How could he make them understand? This impossible situation defied rational explanation. "Look, I can't account for last night," he said tightly. "But I did not hurt my wife. I could never. You have to believe me." But even as the words left his mouth, Thomas saw the wall of skepticism in Nowak's flinty stare. The evidence was stacked against him. The blood, the missing hours, his bumbling confusion. They had him in their crosshairs, a suspect in a crime he couldn't even be sure he didn't commit. As the grueling questions dragged on, a sickening realization crystallized in Thomas's mind. If he was going to clear his name, if he was going to find Emily, he'd have to investigate this nightmare himself. No one else would see past the damning veneer to the lost, terrified man beneath. Hands clenching into fists under the table, Thomas steeled himself for the daunting path ahead, littered with doubts and shadows. He had to retrace his nocturnal footsteps, unearth whatever ugly truths lay buried in his broken memories. For Emily's sake, he had to unravel this mystery, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of himself. There was simply no other choice. Chapter 3. Sleepless Nights. Thomas rubbed his burning eyes, the glare of Dr. Evelyn Strauss's office lights searing through his skull. Days had passed since Emily's disappearance, each hour dragging by in a haze of police interviews, search parties combing the woods, and pitying looks from neighbors. Sleep had become a taunting specter, slipping through his grasp whenever exhaustion finally overwhelmed the sick anxiety churning in his gut. When he managed to drift off, hellish visions paraded behind his lids like grotesque courtiers. Emily's face frozen in terror, the coppery taste of blood, a sinister whisper urging him toward darkness. "I know this is difficult, Thomas," Dr. Strauss said softly, dragging him back to the stark present. "But anything you can tell me about your sleep patterns could help establish a timeline." He met the doctor's gentle gaze, finding solace in her open, non-judgmental expression. She'd been treating his sleepwalking for months now, the only one besides Emily he'd trusted with his secret struggle. "Ever since that night, I've been too afraid to sleep," Thomas admitted, voice haggard. "I'm terrified I'll wake up somewhere else, with fresh horrors I can't undo." Dr. Strauss nodded, her corn silk hair glinting under the fluorescence. "Severe stress can absolutely trigger more frequent sleepwalking episodes, and with the added emotional trauma..." She trailed off tactfully. Scrubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw, Thomas sighed. "The thing is, before all this, I thought I had a handle on it. The meds were keeping episodes at bay. Emily," his voice cracked, "she always helped me through the really bad nights." A pang lanced through his chest as memories unfurled. Emily's soothing touch after a disorienting awakening, her unwavering acceptance that underneath this bizarre affliction was still the man she loved. What cruel irony that she should disappear on the night his demons saw fit to hijack him. "Thomas," Dr. Strauss pulled him from the maudlin spiral of his thoughts. "I know it feels impossible right now, but we need to focus on getting you quality sleep again. It's critical for stabilizing your mental state." Thomas barked a humorless laugh. "Easier said than done, Doc. Every time I close my eyes, I picture Emily out there, needing me, while I'm trapped in some godforsaken dream world." The doctor leaned forward, eyes intent. "I hear you, but consider, if your sleepwalking self was the last to interact with Emily that night, then rebuilding that bridge to your subconscious could be key to discovering what happened." A chill skittered down Thomas's spine at the thought of willingly engaging with his dark passenger. But Dr. Strauss had a point. Those lost hours could hold the key to the mystery ensnaring him. "I'll give you a new short-term prescription for Ambien," the doctor continued. "It can suppress REM sleep and dream recall at first, which may give your psyche a much-needed respite. Once you're more rested, we can work on techniques to control your nocturnal experiences rather than fear them." Thomas accepted the prescription slip with numb fingers, the weight of his exhaustion suddenly crashing over him in a suffocating wave. He'd spent so long at war with his own circadian nature, fighting his body's craving for slumber. Perhaps it was time for an uneasy truce. As he shuffled from Dr. Strauss's office, the phantom sensation of Emily's fingers twining with his tingled across his palm. A fierce determination sparked to life in his stomach. He would claw back control of his twilight self, wrestle answers from its capricious clutches. For her sake, he had to try. That night, curled into sheets that still smelled faintly of Emily's lavender shampoo, Thomas dry swallowed the small white pills and surrendered himself to the waiting blackness, praying revelations awaited in his dreams. But the dark behind his eyes proved fickle and opaque, and morning came all too soon, no closer to the truth. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The scent of aging paper and dust motes hung thick in the air of Milburn's public library, a hushed sanctum of towering shelves and amber-tinged lamps. Thomas sat huddled over a scarred oak table, reference books fanned out before him like ancient arcane texts. Words swam across the pages, blurring together into an indecipherable jumble as fatigue clawed at the edges of his focus. Local history books, newspaper archives on microfiche, folktale compendiums. He'd pored over them all, searching for any scrap of information to contextualize his condition. A sick, nagging dread had taken root in his chest, fed by Dr. Strauss's gentle probing into whether he'd always been fully himself during sleepwalking episodes. The implication was clear. Some insidious persona could be steering his somnambulant body, a dark conductor orchestrating actions beyond his control. Thomas scrubbed at his stubbled jaw, trying to dispel the chill raising gooseflesh on his arms. Lack of sleep had ratcheted his nerves to a razor's edge, every shadow seeming to flicker with menace. Fragments of dreams haunted his waking thoughts. Blood-soaked hands shaping themselves into claws, a twisted reflection grinning from a cracked mirror. All of it opaque, maddening in its refusal to yield answers. A crinkled sheaf of newsprint caught his eye, edges gone yellow with age. "Local man vanishes during sleepwalking episode," the headline blared. Heart quickening, Thomas scanned the article, a queasy sensation building in his stomach. Walter Greaves, 38, disappeared from his home on Tuesday night while in the grips of his alleged sleepwalking fits, he read. Wife Beatrice Greaves reported her husband missing after waking at 2 a.m. to find him gone, the front door ajar. Mr. Greaves had a history of perambulating at night, often waking in strange locales with no memory of his travels. Authorities conducted search parties, but no trace of the man was ever found. The rest of the piece speculated on Greaves' fate, a fatal accident while caught in a fugue state, a cleverly staged abandonment of his former life. Dark allusions to other such disappearances dotted Milburn's history, somnambulism the common thread. The words victims of their own subconscious leaped out with morbid significance. Thomas set the paper down, hands shaking. Did a similar fate now stalk him? Would his own night-shadowed self spirit him away from all he held dear? A helpless passenger as his life imploded? A surge of impotent anger gnawed at his throat. He needed answers, not more fuel for his growing paranoia. A name caught his eye, scrawled in the margins of a musty tome. Nora Bennett, local expert on sleepwalking lore? Heart-pounding, Thomas pulled out his phone and searched for the name. Just one hit, deep in a blog comment thread. For experienced insight Milburn Sleepwalkers, pay a visit to Nora Bennett, out by the old mill. She'll tell you what your fancy doctors won't. Was it foolish to put stock in what amounted to barely a rumor? Perhaps. But Thomas was desperate enough to grasp at any thread now, his sanity unraveling with each answerless day. Snapping a photo of the library's faded map, he exited into the slanting afternoon light, squinting against the sun's glare. Somewhere out there, buried in the mists of Milburn's checkered past, lay a key to this waking nightmare. He just had to dig it out before the shadows swallowed him whole. The drive out to Nora Bennett's remote cottage passed in a blur, dense forest crowding the narrow dirt road. By the time he pulled up to the ramshackle house, dusk had fallen, draping the sagging porch and overgrown garden in shades of murky blue. Thomas approached the weathered front door, its green paint peeling like a molted snakeskin. He raised a fist to knock, but before he could connect, the door swung inward with a plaintive creak. A face appeared in the gloom within. A woman, deeply lined in gray, eyes glinting with sharp appraisal. "Well now," Nora Bennett rasped, "another soul come to learn the truth of his twilight wanderings, I'll wager." She beckoned him inside with a crooked finger, and Thomas obeyed. a frisson of unease dancing down his spine. The room beyond smelled of herbs and dust, crowded with arcane bric-a-brac, a scrying mirror, a taxidermy crow, leather-bound books with occult symbols marching across their spines. "You're not the first sleepwalker drawn to my door," Nora said, sinking into a moth-eaten armchair. "Nor will you be the last, I suspect, until Milburn sees fit to reckon with its restless shadows." Thomas perched on the edge of the sofa across from her, the mention of restless shadows sending a chill finger trailing up his neck. Could this strange old woman truly hold insight into his fractured state? Licking dry lips, he leaned forward, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Something happened to my wife. She disappeared on a night I was sleepwalking. I think I might have done something to her." Nora cocked her head, assessing him with flinty eyes. "Aye, it's a heavy burden, not knowing what misdeeds your body commits in the dark. Makes you wonder what lurks in the locked rooms of your own mind, don't it?" Thomas nodded jerkily, his worst fears given voice. Have you heard of this happening before? People vanishing around sleepwalkers?" The old woman steepled gnarled fingers beneath her chin, gaze going distant as if peering into unseen realms. "Oh, it's been known to happen from time to time. When a body's not anchored to itself in sleep," Nora continued, "all manner of queer things can slip through the cracks. Hungry things, born of rage and sorrow and old wounds that fester in the dark." Thomas's mouth went dry, a creeping horror unfurling in his chest. What kind of things?" Nora leveled him with a solemn stare. "They have many names, shades, fetches, doppelgangers, a living shadow that cleaves to a soul, feeding on all the ugly morsels we try to bury deep. And when the borders of sleep and waking blur, they can take the reins." A high-pitched ringing bloomed in Thomas's ears. The twisted reflection from his dream flashed across his mind's eye, lips peeling back from too many teeth. "How do I stop it?" he asked hoarsely. "How do I keep it from hurting anyone else?" The old woman sighed, a sound like wind through bare branches. "There are ways, rituals and rites to bind a fetch or banish it, but it'll take a toll, mark my words. You'll have to confront your own inner darkness, stare it right in its black eyes. Not many have the strength for that." Thomas's fingernails bit into his palms as he clenched his fists. The thought of facing the shadowed corners of himself, the ugly truths scuttling beneath his subconscious, made his gorge rise. But what choice did he have? If this fetch had Emily, if it planned to puppeteer him into further horrors, he couldn't let that happen, not while there was still breath in his body. "Tell me what I need to do," he said, voice leaden with grim resolve. "I'll pay your price, whatever it is." Nora studied him for a long moment, gaze boring into his like a gimlet. Then with a grunt, she leveraged herself out of her chair and tottered to the far wall. Her knobby fingers skimmed over the books crowding the shelves until they landed on a slim black volume that she extracted with a papery rustle. "This text contains forgotten lore, passed down through certain families in Milburn," she said, pressing the book into Thomas's hands. Its cover was soft with age, embossed with strange spiraling symbols. "There are wards against shadow selves within, talismans to craft, incantations to recite, protection for a price." Thomas thumbed through the brittle pages, head swimming with a sudden vertigo. Diagrams of the human form wound through with thorny vines, harsh syllables of unknown tongues marching across the margins. It was all academic to him, this hidden world pulsing beneath the surface of his humdrum existence. But he'd come this far, followed fate's brambled path to Nora's door. If this book, with its uncanny secrets, could shield him long enough to save Emily, he had to try, for both their sakes. "I'll do it," he said roughly, meeting Nora's watery blue stare. I'll start tonight." The old woman nodded, laying a papery hand on his arm. Her skin was cold, despite the muggy closeness of the room. "Be wary, young man," she murmured. "When you call your fetch to heal, it'll fight you with all it has. The hardest battle's not with the beast, but with the man who made it." An icy trickle sluiced down Thomas's spine at her words. In his marrow, he knew she was right. This path would force him to confront ugliness he'd long buried. Resentments, weaknesses, old shame scrabbling in his mental corners. The prospect made him want to turn tail and flee, retreating to the simple comforts of his daylight self. But Emily's face swam before him, her whiskey-warm eyes and soft smile. She'd walked beside him for better or worse, accepting his fractured edges. He owed her this, a plunge into the abyss, to drag her back from the jaws of his own darkness. Thomas rose on unsteady legs, clutching the book to his chest like a shield. Nora watched him, something like pity softening her weathered face. "Thank you," he said, the words scraping his throat. "For the book, for not thinking I'm insane." Nora shook her head, lips quirking. "Oh, I never said you weren't a little cracked, boy. We all are in our own ways. It's what you do with the broken bits that matters." He huffed a laugh, surprised at the small release of tension in his shoulders. Then, with a final nod, he let himself out of the cottage, the door groaning shut behind him. Night had fallen in earnest now, the moon a baleful eye glowering above the tree line. Thomas climbed into his car, laying the book reverently on the passenger seat. His hands shook as he turned the key in the ignition, the enormity of the task ahead crashing over him. But he wouldn't falter now. Not with stakes this high, the woman he loved waiting in some liminal space between shadow and light. He'd walk through fire for her, confront legions of his own demons. As he turned back onto the winding road, the first lines of a protective incantation rose to his lips. The uncanny syllables tasted of metal and smoke, ancient magic stirring to life on his tongue. He only hoped it would be enough to see him safely to dawn. Chapter 5. Growing Suspicion. The Reed house loomed gray and lifeless under an overcast sky, its white shutters hanging askew like crooked teeth. Thomas sat in his idling car, staring up at the place he'd called home for the past 5 years, his and Emily's shared sanctuary, now transformed into a hollow mausoleum of memories. Ever since his visit to Nora, the whispers had started. Sidelong looks from neighbors as he collected the mail, conversations tapering off when he entered a room. Millburn was a small town, and news of the police investigation had spread like a noxious weed, choking out any benefit of the doubt. Fingers tightening on the steering wheel, Thomas thought back to the excruciating dinner at Emily's parents' house the night before. The forced pleasantries, her mother's red-rimmed eyes constantly flicking to the empty chair at his side. The unspoken question hanging heavy in the air, "What did you do to our daughter?" He'd stammered his way through vague non-answers, stomach roiling with guilt and grief. How could he even begin to explain? That he suspected some malevolent shade wearing his face had spirited Emily away? That he was desperately trying to rein in powers beyond his ken before they destroyed everything he held dear? They'd think him mad. Hell, maybe he was. But the alternative, that he'd deliberately harmed the woman he loved more than life itself, was unthinkable. Bile scorched the back of his throat at the very notion. Shaking off the memory, Thomas stepped out of the car and made his way up the porch steps, black book tucked under his arm. The air felt oppressive, heavy with unseen menace. As he fumbled with his keys, the skin on the back of his neck prickled. Slowly he turned. There, at the end of the driveway, a dark figure, features obscured by shadow, watching him. A spike of fear lanced through Thomas's chest. He blinked hard, and the figure vanished, like a half-glimpsed specter. Heart pounding, he shouldered his way inside, slamming the door behind him. The house was dim and silent, dust motes swirling in the weak light filtering through drawn curtains. Thomas stood frozen in the foyer, suddenly overcome by a bone-deep sensation of wrongness. This place, once his refuge, it felt violated now, tainted by the vacuum of Emily's absence and the sinister mystery clinging to him like grave dirt. He wanted to turn and flee, escape the miasma of dread saturating every room. But there was nowhere to go. This was his battle to fight, on the very ground that had birthed his demons. Squaring his shoulders, Thomas climbed the stairs to the bedroom. It was time to dig deeper, to comb through the shattered fragments of that fateful night. He'd barely stepped over the threshold when it hit him, the cloying metallic tang of blood. His knees buckled as he clutched the doorframe, a tidal wave of nausea crashing over him. Oh God, it was everywhere. Rusty smears on the carpet, the bedsheets, soaked into the mattress. How had he not seen before? Reeling, Thomas stumbled to the bathroom and retched into the toilet. This couldn't be happening. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images continued their hellish parade. Emily's blood painting their marital bed, his own hands sticky and crimson. What if it was all true? If some repressed rage had boiled over, A lifetime of swallowed resentments exploding out of him in one irreversible act? Echoes of hushed arguments flickered through his head, moments when Emily's well-meaning concern had chafed against his stubborn pride. Had his fetch simply manifested the ugliness he'd never dared voice? "No," he choked out. "No, I couldn't. I would never." But a small, insidious voice whispered from some dark recess of his psyche, "Wouldn't you? To be free of this burden, this anchor around your neck?" You were shackled to her pity, suffocated by her cloying care. Maybe this shadow self just had the stones to finally cut you loose. Revulsion rose like bile in Thomas's throat. He smashed a fist into the mirror, spiderwebbing cracks across his haggard reflection. The voice was wrong. It had to be. He loved Emily, needed her like air in his lungs. Whoever had hurt her, it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Breathing hard, he retrieved the black book from where it had fallen. The ritual of warding, just like Nora had shown him. He had to shore up his mental defenses, block out the poisoned doubts oozing in his mind. With shaking hands, he flipped to the correct page and began to chant. The uncanny words rasped in his throat like ground glass, setting his teeth on edge. A chill wind rattled the windows as if in answer, the scent of ozone thickening in the air. Slowly, painstakingly, Thomas felt a barrier crystallizing around his churning thoughts. Fragile, gossamer thin. But there, a whisper-fine boundary between the self he knew and the shadows scrabbling at the edges. It would have to be enough. Just a few more hours until dark, until his body succumbed to its treacherous pulls. And then he would see if Nora's wards held fast against whatever foulness crept beneath his skin. Clutching Emily's pillow to his chest, Thomas sank to the blood-spattered floor and let the tears come, silent and scalding. Her scent lingered on the fabric, a gutting reminder of all he'd lost, all he still stood to lose. Beyond the window, dusk bled across the sky like an open wound. The darkness was rising to claim him. All he could do was pray he'd be strong enough to face it. Chapter 6. Cryptic Warning. The nightmare crashed over Thomas in a black wave, dragging him down into an unfathomable darkness. He thrashed against it, desperate for any anchor in the roiling murk, but there was only an endless void yawning wide to swallow him whole. Then, a pinprick of light. Distant, flickering, but undeniably there. Thomas fought toward it with the last shreds of his strength, kicking and clawing through the icy black. The light grew until it eclipsed his vision, searing, blinding, a shocking flare stabbing through the night. With a ragged gasp, Thomas jackknifed upright. He was in bed, his and Emily's bed, sheets tangled around his sweat-slicked limbs. Afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, painting gold bars across the floor. What? His head pounded like a war drum. The last thing he remembered was sinking into a restless doze, Nora's black book clutched in one white-knuckled hand. How long had he been out? Hours? Days? Gingerly, he extricated himself from the covers and stumbled to the bathroom. His reflection stared back at him from the cracked mirror, haggard and hollow-eyed, and there, on his right palm, an angry red welt, blistered skin in the distinct shape of an open eye. A frisson of unease danced down Thomas's spine. That symbol, he'd seen it before, inked in spidery strokes across the pages of Nora's book, hovering above illustrations of men cleaved by their own shadows. What fresh hell had his sleeping mind traversed? Swallowing hard, he turned on the tap and let cool water sluice over the burn. The pain was a dull, pulsing thing, an insistent reminder of something. A message, perhaps, or a warning from beyond the veil of consciousness. He had to get back to Nora. If anyone could divine meaning from this eerie brand, it was the old woman with her knowing eyes and cryptic whispers. The drive to her remote cottage passed in a blur of winding roads and lengthening shadows. Thomas's thoughts spun like a broken carousel, flashes of his nightmares bleeding into waking anxiety. Emily's face rippled behind his eyes, contorted in terror. A black-nailed hand clamped around her throat. His hand. No. He shook his head hard, dispelling the ghastly image. It was a trick of his exhausted mind, just more poison dredged up by his guilty conscience. He couldn't give it power. Not now, with Nora's secrets waiting to be unlocked. But when he pulled up to the witch's ramshackle house, A leaden dread settled in his gut. The windows gaped dark and vacant, the garden a tangle of chaotic overgrowth. Heart in his throat, Thomas mounted the porch steps, each creaking board a gunshot in the eerie hush. The front door swung open under his touch, a charnel house reek gusting out to meet him. "Nora," he called, the name sticking in his suddenly parched throat. "It's Thomas Reed. I found something." Only silence answered. With mounting trepidation, he stepped into the gloom, fumbling for a light switch. The bulb sputtered to sickly life, and Thomas recoiled in horror. Nora lay crumpled on the floor in a halo of crimson, sightless eyes fixed on the nicotine-stained ceiling. Her throat gaped in a glistening second smile, ropes of glistening viscera spilling from a ragged hole in her abdomen. Blood spatter arced across the walls, an abstract masterpiece of violence and brutality. A choked sound tore from Thomas's chest, a wordless keen of revulsion and disbelief. He stumbled backwards, skull pounding, stomach heaving with nausea. This couldn't be real. It had to be another nightmare, a fresh hell conjured by his fracturing psyche. But the blood. God, there was so much blood. The coppery stench of it coated his tongue, thick and cloying, and that wound in her gut savage and tearing, as if clawed out by an animal. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, but the grisly tableau refused to vanish. Nora, dead, butchered like a lamb on the altar of his own madness. Because that's what this had to be, right? The handiwork of his shadowed twin, the beast wearing his skin. Who else would? A glint of metal caught his eye. There, on the floorboards, half hidden under a gory coil of intestine, a long, wicked hunting knife. And wrapped around the hilt, viscera slick and damning, a single bloody thumbprint, a perfect match for his own. Ice flooded Thomas's veins. No, it wasn't possible. He couldn't have. But the evidence was right there, stark and undeniable. Nora's butchered body, his mark on the murder weapon. Had his fetch truly been capable of this? He thought of Nora's words, her warnings of the darkness lurking beneath a fractured psyche. Of Emily, lost and afraid, victim to the same gnashing jaws that had ripped the life from this defenseless old woman. Oh God, what if she was already... A buzzing static filled his head, a whining whiteout that blotted out all thought. This was too much, too huge and horrific to comprehend. He had to get out, had to run, had to... Thomas whirled toward the door and froze. There, in the rectangle of fading daylight, a figure, tall and broad, features obscured by shadow, and yet achingly familiar. As he watched in mounting terror, the figure raised an arm, a hand unfurled from the darkness, pale and long-fingered, beckoning. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to scramble as far from this nightmare as his leaden legs could carry him. But something else, something primal and magnetic, drew him toward the silhouette in the doorway. One step, two. Each footfall dragged like he was mired in molasses, the soles of his shoes tacky with drying gore. The figure waited, impassive, a void cut into the shape of a man. "Who?" Thomas's voice cracked on the syllable. He swallowed thickly, forced the words out. "Who are you?" The figure cocked its head, a gesture at once alien and uncannily familiar. When it spoke, the voice was a razor-wire rasp, flensing the air between them. "Oh, Tommy boy, you know who I am." And God help him, he did. That voice, those words, shearing straight to the heart of him. It was the whisper that had always lurked at the edges of his consciousness, the grinning shadow glimpsed in the periphery. "You're not real," Thomas choked out. "You're just a manifestation, a split in my fucked up psyche." The figure laughed, a sound like carrion crows taking flight. "Is that what you need to tell yourself? That I'm just some symptom of your moral sickness?" It stepped closer, eclipsing the dying light, and Thomas's knees nearly buckled. Because the face emerging from the gloom, it was his own, twisted and terrible, lips skinned back from sharkish teeth, eyes black as pitch, but undeniably, damningly him. Poor little Thomas, his doppelganger sneered. So desperate to believe he's not the monster, that the blood on his hands is just a bad dream. Thomas shook his head wildly, stumbling back. "No, I didn't. Emily, his fetch hissed, a grotesque mockery of tender concern. Sweet, simpering Emily, Always trying to fix you, wasn't she? To save you from yourself. As if she could ever understand our hunger. Bile seared Thomas's throat, tears blurring the horrific vision before him. What did you do? His voice splintered, jagged with despair. Where is my wife? The other him smiled, a savage slash of teeth in the dark. Where she belongs, Tommy. With me. In the shadows you tried so hard to forget. A sob wrenched itself from Thomas's chest, an animal sound of grief and rage. He lunged at his leering twin, hands outstretched to throttle the life from its lying throat, but his fingers closed on empty air, the figure dissolving like mist between one blink and the next. Unbalanced, Thomas crashed to his knees, the impact jarring through his bones. He knelt there, gulping tortured breaths, Nora's blood cooling on his skin. This couldn't be happening. Madness had finally claimed him, dragged him down into a never-ending fugue of guilt and terror. But no, he couldn't succumb. Not now, with Emily still lost, still needing him. He had to hold fast to his crumbling sanity, had to believe that the man he knew himself to be was stronger than the shadow wearing his skin. With a shaking hand, Thomas fumbled in his jacket pocket. His fingers closed on cool metal, the ornate disc Nora had pressed into his palm just days ago, during his first desperate visit. A talisman, she'd called it. A ward to set the mind, keep tethered the soul. His thumb found the embossed symbol, traced its whirling lines. He'd been so skeptical then, so hesitant to buy into Nora's occult whisperings. But now, with reality unspooling around him, and his darkest self bearing grinning witness, Thomas closed his eyes, whispered the words Nora had taught him. The strange syllables tasted of smoke and blood on his tongue, ancient and heavy. He felt a subtle shift in the air, a prickling across his scalp like the gathering of a distant storm. When he opened his eyes, the world seemed to resettle around him, sharper, more solid. The creeping unreality held at bay. Thomas pushed himself to his feet, the talisman a comforting weight against his chest. He couldn't unsee Nora's butchered corpse, couldn't banish the sticky residue of horror coating his skin. But he could move forward, clinging to the gossamer threads of hope. Somewhere out there, Emily was waiting. Somehow, someway, he would bring her home. The sun dipped below the tree line as Thomas stumbled from the house, the shadows reaching to swallow him whole. But he pushed on, chin up, shoulders squared. His path was set now, wending deep into the heart of his own darkness, and God help any fiend or fetch that tried to stop him. Chapter 7. Troubled Dreams. The ceiling of the motel room swam in and out of focus, water-stained tiles blurring into meaningless swirls. Thomas lay on the lumpy mattress, hands folded over his chest, staring up at nothing. He'd been like this for hours, ever since staggering to this dingy way station on the edges of town, blood-spattered and reeking of smoke. The acrid scent still clung to him, a sulphurous reminder of what he'd left in his wake. Nora's body, her books, her charms, her trove of uncanny secrets, all consigned to the hungry flames devoured by the cleansing blaze. It was the only way, he told himself, the only path forward. No trails, no traces, no breadcrumbs for the authorities to follow. Just ashes on the wind, a sacrifice to whatever dark forces had shattered his life. He'd sobbed as he watched her cottage burn, great heaving gasps that felt ripped from his hollows. Nora, with her knowing eyes and whiskey-rough voice, his last tether to a world that made sense, to rules and reason, and a self he recognized. Now it was just him and the shadow wearing his face, the grinning darkness that had clawed its way out of his fractured psyche. Emily's abductor, Nora's murderer, his own worst self, unleashed like a slavering beast. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against his sockets until starbursts danced on the insides of his lids. He couldn't think about that, about the blood on his doppelganger's hands and what it might mean for his missing wife. Madness lurked in the margins of those thoughts, a howling void waiting to swallow him whole. Sleep. He needed sleep. A few blessed hours of oblivion before he took up the hunt again. His body was a live wire of exhaustion, strung out and sparking, a taut tripwire of dread and desperation. But every time he teetered on the knife's edge of unconsciousness, his fetch's words came slithering back, insidious as black oil. She's with me, Tommy. In the shadows you tried so hard to forget. A growl of frustration tore from his throat. He couldn't succumb to taunting, not now. He needed a clear head, a shard of lucidity to light his way. Forcing his leaden limbs to cooperate, Thomas pushed himself upright, scrubbing at his grainy eyes. His gaze snagged on the talisman sitting on the nightstand, its embossed surface winking in the sallow lamplight. The sight of it, the memory of Nora's blood-slick fingers pressing it into his shaking hand, sent a barb of grief lancing through him. But no, he couldn't fall apart, not when it was his only lifeline. Snatching up the amulet, Thomas curled his fingers around its solid weight, feeling the whorls and ridges bite into his skin. He'd never put much stock in Nora's occult whisperings, chalking it up to folklore and suggestible minds, but the memory of his other self coalescing from the dark, sneering with his stolen face, it defied all logic, spat in the face of a rational world. If he was going to beat this thing, to claw Emily back from its shadowed clutches, he had to fight it on its own uncanny turf, and that meant leaning into Nora's teachings, no matter how fantastical they seemed in the cold light of day. Turning the talisman over in his hands, Thomas studied the symbol etched into its surface, a stylized eye, lidded and lashed, wreathed in spiraling lines. A sign of wakefulness, Nora had told him, of tethering the conscious mind to the body in sleep. The words of her incantation rose unbidden to his lips, their syllables heavy and strange on his tongue. As he chanted, he felt a subtle charge building in the air, a prickle of electricity dancing across his skin. His eyelids grew heavier with each phrase, a warm lassitude suffusing his aching limbs. The room blurred at the edges, colors bleeding into indistinct smears. But instead of fighting the pull of gravity, Thomas let it take him, sinking back onto the mattress, as the amulet hummed against his chest. And then he was gone, slipping beneath the dark waters of sleep like a stone into a bottomless pool. Down and down he sank, the waking world receding above him, until only velvety blackness remained. But it wasn't the peaceful oblivion of dreamless slumber. Shapes moved in the periphery, slithering suggestions of form and figure. Whispers threaded through the dark, sibilant and cloying, a discordant chorus twining around his sleeping mind. "Thomas," they hissed, 1,000 serpentine tongues flickering in the void. "Thomas." He tried to turn away, to will himself deaf to their insidious susurrus. But the voices were inside him, vibrating along his very bones, impossible to shut out. "You can't hide from us's," they crooned. "We are the shattered pieces of your sea soul, the wants and rages that you smothered, and now we have her, your precious is Emily." Thomas thrashed against the suffocating dark, a voiceless scream building in his throat. No, it couldn't be true. It had to be a trick, a taunt to torment his fevered psyche. But an image unfurled before him like a noxious flower. Emily, bound and terrified, her hair a tangled curtain around her ashen face. And crouched over her, all angles and teeth and oil-slick eyes, his fetch, his shadow self, grinning that savage grin, hands caressing Emily's tear-streaked cheek with grotesque tenderness. It looked up, met Thomas's sleeping gaze, and its smile widened. "See," it hissed, "I have her, I have all of her, and soon I'll have you too, Tommy boy. Mind, body, and soul, there's no escape." Horror rose in Thomas's gorge, mingled with a despair so vast it threatened to drown him. He tried to claw his way back to wakefulness, to rip away this nightmare veil, and emerge gasping into the light. But the darkness was too thick, too glutinous, holding him fast in its phantasmagoric grip. He could only watch, helpless and mute, as his fetch leaned down to Emily's ear, lips brushing her skin as it whispered some unspeakable obscenity. She flinched away, a sob racking her slender frame, and something broke in Thomas. A white-hot shard of rage and defiance lancing through the fog of horror. This was his wife, his love, the axis around which his world spun. And no fiend or phantasm, birthed from his own fractured mind or elsewhere, would lay hands upon her while he still drew breath. "Enough!" The roar ripped from his dream self's throat, raw and ragged, an eruption of pure animal fury. He lunged at the fetch, hands outstretched to throttle, to rend, to banish this foul thing wearing his stolen skin. But before he could make contact, before his fingers could close around that lying throat, the scene shattered. Emily, the fetch, the cloying dark, all of it burst apart like a mirror dashed to glittering shards. And Thomas was falling, plummeting through a kaleidoscopic void, shot through with whirling bits of color and sound. Down and down he tumbled, buffeted by shrieking winds, the shattered pieces of the nightmare scoring his skin like icy razors. With a gasping shudder, his eyes flew open. He was back in the motel room, tangled in the sweat-soaked sheets, Nora's amulet clutched white-knuckled to his hammering chest. The transition was so jarring, so sudden, that for a moment he could only lay there gulping air, tremors racking his frame. A dream. It had been a dream, a macabre projection spun from his own spiraling fears. Emily wasn't. She couldn't be. But even as the thought formed, Thomas knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it was more than a simple nightmare. There had been an undeniable veracity to it, a tactility that transcended the usual surrealism of dream logic. The sour tang of Emily's terror on his tongue, the oil-slick glint of his fetch's eyes. It had been real somehow, in some liminal place between sleep and waking, and that could only mean one thing. His shadow self, the splintered remnant of his blackest impulses, had Emily. Had taken her to whatever netherworld it called home, a prison of his own making turned inside out. Bile scorched the back of Thomas's throat, despair mingling with a churning nausea. God, what it must be doing to her there, in that abyss of repressed hungers and unspoken horrors. The thought of that thing's hands on her, its poisoned words dripping into her ears. A keening sound wrenched itself from his chest, a wordless cry of impotence and anguish. He'd failed her, his beautiful, steadfast Emily. Let her fall prey to the monster wearing his face, the sins made manifest. How could he ever hope to reach her, to spirit her back from that shadow realm? He was just a man, weak and fractured, a hollow shell housing a maelstrom. No. Thomas cut off the spiraling thoughts with a near physical wrench, gritting his teeth against the tidal wave of despair. He couldn't fall apart now, not when Emily needed him most. Needed the man she knew him to be, strong, resilient, unbreakable in his devotion to her. If he gave in to his howling doubts, let them devour him from the inside out. Then his fetch had already won. With a shaking hand, he reached for Nora's amulet, the metal warm and almost thrumming beneath his fingers. It had worked, had shielded him from succumbing entirely to the dream's malevolent embrace. And if it could do that, anchor his mind against his shadow's grasping claws. A flicker of something like hope kindled in Thomas's chest, fragile but stubborn. Nora's teachings, her uncanny secrets, they were his lifeline now, his only chance of navigating the nightmare labyrinth his life had become. He had to lean into them wholly, let them guide him through the looking glass and out the other side. Jaw set with grim purpose, Thomas swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, ignoring the wave of exhaustion crashing over him. Sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford, not with his fetch growing stronger by the hour and Emily suffering in its clutches. He had preparations to make, more of Nora's books to consult, protective wards and rituals to arm himself with, before he could take the fight to the eldritch corners of his own psyche. It would be a battle unlike any he'd ever known, a plunge into the abyss with no guarantee of return. But for Emily, for the chance to hold her safe in his arms again and banish this nightmare to the depths, he would march into hell itself and spit in the devil's eye. Tucking Nora's amulet beneath his sweat-stained shirt, Thomas gathered the scant belongings he'd salvaged from the wreckage of his former life. Then, squaring his shoulders, he stepped out into the ruddy dawn light, painting the motel parking lot a sanguine hue. His shadow stretched long and dark behind him, an umbral twin dogging his heels. But Thomas paid it no mind, his gaze fixed steady on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the veil, his darker half was waiting, wearing his mirrored skin like a conquered flag. And come hell or high water, Thomas would find it, and the precious cargo it had stolen, and drag them both kicking and screaming into the light. The hunt was on. Chapter 8. Shadows Take Shape. The world bled by in a gray-green smear, mist-shrouded trees blurring into streaks of color as Thomas gunned the accelerator. His knuckles ached where they gripped the steering wheel, tendons standing out like twists of rope beneath his skin. He'd been driving for hours, chasing a hunch as insubstantial as dissipating fog. But the amulet thrumming against his chest and the feverish certainty pounding in his temples urged him onward, further into the wooded hills cloaking Milburn's fringes. The area was rife with legend, prickling with eerie tales of unnatural creatures and uncanny vanishings. Nora had spoken of it in hushed tones, her eyes cutting past Thomas to the shadows gathered in the cottage corners. "Steer clear of them hills," she'd rasped, flint sparking behind her roomy gaze. "Steer clear, lest you want to stare down something that's got no truck with the rules of God or man." At the time, he'd dismissed it as backwoods superstition, the ramblings of a mind marinated in folklore and moonshine. But now, with the nightmares still frothing behind his eyes and the scent of Emily's perfume lingering like a ghostly caress, he wasn't so sure. The air seemed to thicken as he wound his way up the serpentine road, tendrils of mist snagging at the tires like grasping fingers. Thomas felt it like a physical weight, a pressure bearing down on his skin and forcing the breath from his lungs in shallow gasps. It had him white-knuckled on the shifter, lips pulled back from his teeth in a near snarl. Would his shadow self sink so low, sequester Emily in some dank cave or abandoned cabin like a 2-bit movie monster? The image curdled in his gut, sour as old milk. But monsters didn't follow human logic, didn't play by society's rules. They carved out their own realities in the hollows and dark places, in the cracks between reason and madness. And wasn't that what his fetch was, in the end? The monstrous ID given form, all his blackest impulses unleashed to wreak havoc? A bitter laugh scraped Thomas's throat raw. To think he'd once fancied himself a good man, a loving husband. What a joke. He'd been a walking time bomb, a pressure cooker of repressed violence and selfish need, just waiting for the right catalyst to blow. And Emily, sweet, kind, endlessly patient Emily, she'd been the unwitting trigger. Her gentle concern, her soft-voiced pleas for him to open up, to share his burdens. They'd wormed under his skin like splinters, needling at the cracks in his fractured psyche. He'd resented her for it, some small, ugly part of him. Resented her for seeing through the mask, for forcing him to confront the naked ugliness festering in his core. It would have been so much easier to keep pretending, to paste on a smile and play the dutiful spouse, while the rot ate him alive from the inside out. But Emily, in her steadfast Emily way, had refused to let him fester. She'd pried at his edges with gentle fingers, coaxing him into the light bit by bit, secret by sordid secret. And with each confession, each bit of poison drawn from the wound, he'd hated her a little more. God, he was a bastard. A weak, pathetic bastard too chicken shit to own his own failings. No wonder his shadow had sprung fully formed from his brow, a grinning Athena birthed from a Zeus too gutless to bear her weight. And now, Emily was paying the price, suffering in some lightless hole while he chased his own twisted tail. Thomas slammed a fist against the steering wheel, relishing the sting of splitting knuckles. He deserved far worse, deserved to have his skin flayed from his bones and his black heart impaled on a rusted spike. But self-flagellation wouldn't save Emily. Only action would, a headfirst plunge into the nightmare his life had become. He had to find her, had to rip her from his doppelganger's clutches and spend the rest of his miserable existence atoning for his sins. As if conjured by his spiraling thoughts, the mist ahead began to coalesce, tendrils weaving together into a shape both alien and uncannily familiar. Thomas's heart stuttered in his chest, adrenaline spiking to a high buzzing whine in his ears. The figure solidified as he watched, colors bleeding into the gray. The dark slash of hair, the pale slash of teeth in a leering grin, the glittering obsidian eyes. His fetch, his shadow self, standing bold in the middle of the road with arms spread wide, inviting him in, daring him to finally face the twisted reflection he'd been running from for so long. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel until the bones creaked, chest heaving with the force of his ragged breaths. This was it, the moment of truth, the threshold between the man he'd been and the monster he might become. He could turn back, slam the car into reverse and peel away, leave Milburn and its horrors in the rear view, find a new town, a new life, build himself back up from the rubble of his fractured existence. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Thomas knew it for the hollow fantasy it was. There was no outrunning this, no burying his head in the sand and pretending the worms weren't eating at his roots. His shadow would always be there, dogging his steps, waiting for the day Thomas's control finally slipped and the festering darkness spewed out like pus from a lanced boil. No, better to face it head on, to look his demons in their oil-slick eyes and spit in their snarling faces. For Emily, for the chance to hold her again and beg her forgiveness. He would descend into the abyss and drag them both out again, or die trying. Jaw clenched so tight his molars creaked, Thomas pressed the accelerator to the floor. The car leapt forward with a throaty roar, eating up the distance between him and his waiting fetch. Closer and closer he raced, the specter of his own dark half looming larger with each passing second. 20 yards, 10, 5, until he could see every hair and pore of that stolen face, the cruel curve of its lips and the glittering malice in its eyes. Thomas braced for impact, for the meaty thunk of a body hitting the hood, but it never came. His fetch seemed to melt around the car like mist, dissolving into tendrils of black smoke that licked along the side panels and seeped through the vents. The stench of it, rotten eggs and burnt matches, filled Thomas's nose and mouth, thick as cotton batting. He gagged, eyes watering, fighting to keep the wheel steady as a laughing voice filled the car's interior. "Closer, Tommy boy! Come closer!" The last thing Thomas saw was the trees ahead, parting like a great green maw, ready to swallow him whole. Then the amulet against his chest exploded into searing heat, and the world went white, then red, then deepest, inkiest black. When he came back to himself, he was slumped over the steering wheel, a thin trickle of blood oozing from his left nostril. The car was stopped, engine ticking as it cooled, wedged halfway down a steep embankment. Through the cracked windshield, Thomas could see the road above, the asphalt crumbled and gaping where he'd breached the guardrail. Overhead, the sky was a leaden caul of storm clouds, gravid with pent lightning. It was the sight beyond the car, though, that had ice water replacing the blood in Thomas's veins. Rising from the forest floor like a jagged tooth, stained and chipped with age, was a cabin that had no earthly business being there, not on any map or survey he'd ever seen. Its timbers were mossy and rotting, the windows cracked and staring like blank eye sockets. And there, carved crudely into the door, was a symbol achingly familiar, a single lidded eye, wreathed in spiraling lines. Thomas was out of the car before he knew he'd moved, stumbling up the root-snarled path on numb legs. His heart thundered in his throat, his lungs straining against the fractured vise of his ribs. She was here, Emily. He could feel it in his gut, taste her honeysuckle scent on the air beneath the mossy decay. Just beyond this dark portal, trapped in the oubliette of his own making. The amulet lay cool and lifeless against his chest now, its protective magic spent. Thomas spared it hardly a glance as he staggered up the creaking porch steps, hand already reaching to push open the weathered door. It swung inward with a groan straight out of every nightmare he'd ever had, revealing an interior all Stygian shadows and moldering furniture. And there in the center of the room, Emily. His beautiful, precious Emily, slumped in a rickety chair with her hands bound behind her. Blood matted her corn silk hair, livid bruises blooming on her porcelain skin. Her eyes were closed, chest barely rising with each thready breath. A wounded noise tore from Thomas's throat, anguish and fury fused into a single animal sound. He launched himself across the room, arms outstretched to gather her close, only to jerk to a spine-jarring halt a foot from his wife's unconscious form. He strained against the invisible bonds holding him fast, muscles bunching and veins rising, but it was like fighting a steel trap. "Ah!" a voice tutted, poison honey dripping from each syllable. "Wouldn't want to end the game so soon, would we?" Thomas wrenched his head around, teeth bared in a snarl. There, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, was his fetch. His twisted mirror wearing his face like a cheap Halloween mask. It cocked its head, the motion at once alien and achingly familiar. "Hello, Tommy boy," it crooned. "So kind of you to finally join our little party." Impotent rage swelled beneath Thomas's skin, pulsing in time to the throbbing in his skull. He struggled harder against his phantom shackles, every atom of his being straining toward his battered wife. "Let her go, you son of a bitch," he roared. "I'm here now, you've got me. Just let her go." His fetch clicked its tongue, oil-slick eyes glittering with obscene delight. "Oh, but where would be the fun in that?" it purred, trailing a pointed nail along Emily's ashen cheek. "Sweet Emily and I were just getting acquainted. Wouldn't want to cut our playdate short," Thomas bellowed, a wordless explosion of horror and fury, as the fetch dipped its head to run a serpentine tongue along the curve of Emily's throat. She shuddered in her stupor, a single crystalline tear tracing a path through the grime on her face. In that moment, staring into the abyss of his own darkest reflections, Thomas felt something give way inside him. A support beam snapping, a foundational structure crumbling to dust. The things he'd fought so hard to suppress, the seething cauldron of rage and passion and violence, came rushing to the surface in a scalding torrent. "I said," Thomas growled, each word precise as a scalpel's cut, "let her go." Something in his voice, some razor's edge of barely leashed savagery, made his fetch pause. It straightened slowly, head cocking like a bird of prey, obsidian gaze boring into Thomas with laser focus. "Well, well, well," it murmured. "The mouse has teeth after all." A slow Cheshire grin split its face, all needle-sharp edges. "I was starting to think you'd disappoint me, Tommy boy." Thomas bared his own teeth in response, a feral grimace. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he bit out. "I had to sort through a lot of bullshit to get here." "Ah, yes, that pesky conscience of yours." His fetch waved a dismissive hand. "Always nattering on about right and wrong, good and evil, as if the world was so black and white." It leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We know better, don't we, Tommy? We know that sometimes, to get what you want, you have to paint in shades of red." Thomas's nostrils flared, revulsion warring with a sickening sort of recognition in his gut. Because as much as he wanted to deny it, to shove the words back down his shadow's lying throat, a part of him understood. A part of him, the part currently straining against its bonds like a rabid dog, heard the siren song beneath the poison. Because what if his fetch was right? What if the only way to save Emily, to pry her from the jaws of this nightmare, was to embrace the darkness coiled inside him like a sleeping serpent, to unleash the beast and let it tear through anything in its path, consequences be damned? As if sensing the direction of Thomas's thoughts, his shadow's grin widened. "Yes," it hissed, a hungering light in its eyes. "You feel it, don't you? The power lurking beneath your skin, begging to be set free? It's intoxicating, isn't it?" Thomas's head swam, vertigo clutching at him with dizzying fingers. The air felt too thick, too charged, pressing in on him from all sides. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything but the insidious whisper boring into his brain. "Just let go, Tommy," his fetch crooned. "Let go and embrace your true self, the self you've spent so long burying under layers of guilt and repression. Emily will be yours again, and so much more besides. All you have to do is stop fighting." For a moment, the space between one labored breath and the next, Thomas wavered. His ironclad control, maintained through years of gritted teeth and white knuckles, slipped a fraction. The darkness within, so long denied, surged forward in a black wave, howling its triumph. It would be so easy to succumb, to relinquish the reins and let his inner demons ride him roughshod into oblivion. No more fear, no more doubt, no more sickening self-loathing curdling in his gut. Just blessed silence and the raw, raging fire of his unleashed ID. But then, through the crimson haze hazing his vision, Thomas caught a glimpse of Emily. His Emily, so strong and kind and endlessly forgiving. Beaten and bound by the monster wearing his face, suffering for his sins. His beautiful, precious wife, who had seen the rot inside him and loved him anyway. Who had taken his hands, shaking with barely suppressed violence, and gentled them between her own. Who had met his fractured gaze and whispered, "I know who you are, Thomas Reed, and that man is good and true, no matter what the shadows tell you." Like a gust of icy wind cutting through sultry heat, Emily's phantom words pierced the fog enveloping Thomas's mind. The darkness within recoiled, hissing its displeasure, as reason reasserted itself with the force of a crashing wave. What was he thinking? Contemplating surrender? Letting this twisted doppelganger goad him into damnation with a few well-aimed barbs? If he gave in, if he let the beast off its chain to rampage unchecked, he'd be no better than the thing that had stolen his wife. A slavering animal, ruled by impulse and hungry for destruction. And Emily, oh God, Emily. She'd be shackled to that creature for the rest of her days, watching helpless as it wore her husband's skin like a cheap suit. The thought sent howling anguish ripping through Thomas's chest, nearly bowing him double with its force. No, he couldn't do that to her, not even to save her from this horror. She deserved better, deserved the man she knew him to be under all the guilt and grime. The man she'd always seen, even when he couldn't see himself. Resolve hardened in Thomas's gut, chasing away the last clinging tendrils of temptation. He straightened his spine with a Herculean effort, squaring his shoulders as he met his fetch's expectant gaze. "No," he said simply. "I won't be the monster you want me to be. Not now, not ever." For a moment his shadow gaped at him, genuine surprise slackening its features. Then rage contorted its expression into an ugly sneer, black fury seething behind its eyes. "So be it," spat. "If you're too much of a coward to seize your birthright, I'll just have to take it for myself." It raised a hand, fingers curling into claws. "Prepare to join your beloved in oblivion, Tommy boy." But before it could make good on its threat, before those talons could sink into Thomas's yielding flesh, a blinding flash of white light exploded through the room. Thomas cried out, throwing up an arm to shield his watering eyes as the light resolved itself into a shimmering barrier around him and Emily. His fetch shrieked, a sound of thwarted rage and shock, stumbling back with its hands pressed to its face. Smoke curled from between its fingers, the stench of charred meat filling the air. Heart thundering against his ribs, Thomas risked a glance down at his chest. There, blazing like a newborn star against his sweat-soaked shirt, was Nora's amulet. Its protective magic had saved him yet again, throwing up a shield to repel his shadow's murderous intent. But more than that, it had shown Thomas the truth, in one soul-searing instant of blinding illumination. This creature, this fetch, it wasn't some separate entity spawned from the depths of his psyche. It was him, the darkest, basest parts of him given life and form. The hatred, the selfishness, the simmering resentment, they were all his, the ugly flip side to the man Emily loved. But that didn't make them the sum total of his being. They didn't define him, any more than the spots defined a leopard or the thorns defined a rose. He was more than his darkness, more than the twisted impulses riding him in the witching hours. He was a good man, even if he stumbled. A loving husband, even in his moments of selfish weakness. He'd made mistakes, would make more before his time was through, but he would not let them consume him. He would master them, as a rider masters an unbroken horse. As these realizations crashed over Thomas in a tidal wave of blinding clarity, he felt something inside him shift. A lock clicking open, a fist unclenching to reveal a butterfly's wings. The darkness that had dogged him for so long, clotted so thickly around his heart, began to recede. Not vanishing, not entirely. It would always be a part of him, an old traveling companion he met on moonless roads. But it no longer controlled him, no longer drove him like a whipped cur to heel. He was free, battered and bruised, still bleeding from 1,000 invisible wounds, but free. And in that freedom, he finally found the strength to do what needed to be done. Turning to face his fetch head-on, Thomas raised a hand of his own, but not to strike, not to rend and tear as every fiber of him yearned to do. Instead, he extended it palm up, a gesture of peace and acceptance. "Enough," he said, and barely recognized his own voice, calm and sure as summer stone. "It's over. You've lost." The fetch snarled wordlessly, its ravaged face a rictus of hatred and thwarted malice. But Thomas could see the fear beneath, sharp and jagged as a hidden reef. His shadow knew, as surely as he did, that its hold had been broken. "This isn't over," it spat, even as its form began to waver at the edges, dissolving into curling wisps of blackness. "I'll be back, Tommy boy. I'll always be waiting, in the dark corners of your shriveled soul." "I know," Thomas replied almost gently, "and I'll be ready every time, because I'm done running from my demons. From now on, I face them head-on in the light of day." With a final hiss of furious despair, the fetch dissipated entirely, lost to the ether from whence it came. Thomas felt its absence like a lead weight lifting from his shoulders. A noose suddenly snapped. Slowly, hardly daring to trust his trembling legs, he turned to Emily. She was stirring now, the silvery barrier around her melting away to puddle on the floor. Thomas was at her side in an instant, fumbling with her bonds and gathering her into his arms. She came awake with a gasp, eyes flying wide open. For a moment she flailed against him, raw panic giving her spent body a final burst of desperate strength. Then her gaze focused on his face and she went limp, a broken sob hitching in her throat. "Thomas," she croaked, voice rusted from screaming. Is it really you?" "It's me, baby," he whispered brokenly, pressing frantic kisses to her dirt-streaked brow. "It's me, I swear it. The real me, flaws and all." She clung to him, burying her face in the crook of his neck as great racking sobs shook her frame. He held her while she wept, murmuring garbled apologies and promises into the tangled silk of her hair. They remained that way for a long time, rocking gently in the gloom of that cursed cabin, as the amulet's light slowly faded and true dawn began to paint the sky beyond the trees. Two broken souls, clinging together in the wreckage of their private hell. But even as exhaustion dragged at him, even as his own tears mingled with Emily's to soak the collar of his shirt, Thomas felt something kindling in his chest, a tiny spark, fragile as a candle flame cupped in shaking palms. Hope. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he dared to hope that they could heal from this, stitch themselves back together piece by jagged piece, that he could become the man Emily always believed him to be, and build a life worth living in the ashes of this long night. It wouldn't be easy. There would be nightmares, both waking and sleeping, setbacks and relapses, moments when the darkness limbered its claws and the world went gray at the edges. But they would weather them, together, and emerge stronger for the tempering. Because in the end, that was all either of them had ever wanted, to love and be loved in return. Openly, honestly, without reservation or fear. To stand hand in hand before the uncertain future, and know that whatever came, they faced it as one. The sun breached the horizon as Thomas lifted Emily into his arms, her slight weight barely registering through the supernova of emotion expanding in his chest. She curled into him with a sigh, tears still leaking from beneath closed lids, as he carried her from the cabin on steady legs. Behind them, the amulet pulsed one final time, a celebratory flare. Then it dimmed and died, its purpose served. Thomas didn't spare it a backward glance as he strode into the brightening dawn, his wife cradled close and his demons banished to the shadows of memory. He had all he needed, all he'd ever needed, safe in the circle of his arms. And for the first time in a long, long while, the future looked bright. The end,